Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for Survive podcast. And tonight I'm joined by author James Valliant, and we're going to be talking about the never ending confusion of mysticism. And I'm going to be discussing and reminiscing a bit about the past, about the starting of this channel, the different theories um, that I used to look into a while ago. But before I get into any of that, James, why don't you explain what mysticism is exactly to those that might not be so familiar?
Well, I use mysticism. Mysticism generally means it refers to an experience, a mystical experience that people have. So a person is generally regarded as a mystic. They've had some kind of contact with the divine that can't be explained by natural means, such as sense perception or logic or reason. I would broaden out the definition to include any claim to knowing something based on a method other than reason for that for that simple reason. So the mere fact that an idea pops into my head, like elf, say, or ghost, it doesn't oblige reality to actually contain elves or ghosts in it. In reality, I can be wrong. My imagination can come up with all kinds of things. Since my mind can be out of whack, I can be wrong. I have to use a specific means of knowing, and only a certain means of knowledge can do it. So, for example, I know how my senses get me in contact with reality. I know how logic keeps me connected to reality. Those are means by which I come to know reality. Any alternate means of knowing other than reason, that is to say, logic applied, the logical integration of the material provided by the senses, is what I call mysticism, a non rational alleged means of knowing. Horoscopes from astrology, uh, Ouija boards, crystal balls, tea leaves. The ancients used to do it. Ancient Romans used to look at the flight of birds or animal entrails to see what the gods' will was. Any means of knowledge other than reason, an asserted means of knowledge other than reason, I call mysticism. Whether it's divine revelation, faith in an ancient text. Um, I believe that there is only one way of obtaining knowledge, and that is by first of all, it has to be reducible to the evidence of the senses. It has to be connected directly to verifiably observed fact. And at every step of our analysis, we have to be objective. That is to say, we have to follow the rules of inductive and deductive logic, the rules of proper concept formation. And any other means, in my view, is mysticism. So someone doesn't tell you how I know, and they say, I don't know by means of reason, I can't explain it to you. That's a mystic. If someone says they've got one of these other means, a crystal ball, a Ouija board, whatever it is, that's mysticism. So I include in mysticism all claims to non rational knowledge, if that makes sense at all.
Because what fascinates me is there are people out there that will say we can't know anything, and then they'll end up saying, "But we know this," and they end up contradicting themselves.
Well, yes. Universal skepticism, there's really two sides of the same coin. You'll notice that most people will begin their defense of mysticism, their defense of faith, by saying that reason is inadequate, that reason can't work, doesn't get us in contact with reality. Now, of course, reason is effective, does get us, and we land on the moon on a dime every time. We split atoms and release the power of suns. Our capacity for scientific rational thought is obviously very, very powerful. We can acquire knowledge, but we're nothing like omniscient, and I doubt we'll ever be. And we're certainly not infallible. We are fallible and limited. And knowledge is an achievement. Knowledge takes work to get. We have to make sure that we're right. Anything beyond direct observation. I mean, I know this water thing is in front of me by direct observation, but anything beyond that, I have to learn conceptually, and that takes effort, and that requires a specific objective method. Now, universal skepticism is usually a prologue for mystics. There needs to be at least a gap in what reason can do for us. Otherwise, They wouldn't be mystics. Some mystics are radical skeptics altogether. Reason is just an illusion. Reason won't ever, you're just being deluded by your senses. Many religious types of philosophers have argued that through the ages as well. But then, of course, there are your non religious types who discount knowledge altogether. They deny the possibility of any knowledge, whether rational or by any other means, or by any other means. Of course, when we begin, by the time we become philosophers, by the time we're adults, we have a whole mountain of knowledge. Knowledge we acquired directly through our own experience as children, knowledge we acquired inferentially from other people, knowledge we may have learned from books and verified. We get all kinds of knowledge. In fact, to begin to ask questions about knowledge presupposes you have a bunch of knowledge. Otherwise, the question, as you say, doesn't make sense. Every time someone undermines knowledge as such, they are undermining every word they themselves are using. The only consistent position for a universal skeptic is just to shut up, because every word that we use, I mean, every word that we use is an assertion, is an assertion. If I say banana, I don't mean orange or peach or grape, I mean banana. And for you to even know what I mean, for that word to have any meaning in your head at all, implies a whole bunch of knowledge. So just simply, as you point out, to formulate it as that, and they're always doing that. There can't be an argument. Think about that for a second. Argument presupposes that logic is persuasive. Why would one, if one doesn't believe in knowledge, even enact an argument to persuade someone that knowledge is impossible? It's a contradiction in terms. You're using logic to show me that even logic is senseless. Well, why are you wasting your time? If we really can't know, if knowledge is inaccessible, then none of our words, any single word, really has any meaning whatever, nor can any argumentation get us there. All arguments for skepticism, universal skepticism, must fail. Knowledge, like skepticism, is a contextual thing. It's a contextual thing. There's some things I know and there's some things I don't know. I know, for example, I'm having a conversation with you right now. I know that directly. I know that with certainty. But as I move up the chain of abstraction, we go up the level of abstract theory. Our abstract theories can become disconnected from reality. We have to make sure there's a chain all the way back to observation, that we were able to reduce our idea, no matter how abstract it is. And that is what creates the confusion, I think, for people, in that words can seem to be games, in effect. And that's what philosophy is. Modern philosophy has turned the most important and serious of topics, philosophy. And one of its most important, in fact, it's, in my view, it's by far most important role, is in the field of the theory of knowledge, how it is we know. Epistemology, a big word, is that branch of philosophy which studies how we know. Skepticism says the how is precisely what's getting in the way. If our knowledge, for example, if I perceive an apple as red, where is the redness? Is the redness in the apple, or is the redness in my means of perceiving? Well, red is obviously my means of perceiving the apple. My means of perceiving the apple. And typically, skeptics will use the very causal nature of consciousness. Now, consciousness has to operate by a causal means. I have to have some senses to get me in contact with reality. I have to conceptualize, and that's a distinctly human mode of cognition. I have to have consciousness operates by a specific method, uses a specific process. It's an active process, but that just means consciousness possesses an identity like anything else that exists. And philosophers haven't really grappled with the idea yet that consciousness is something that can possess identity. For them, it's a disqualifying feature. Famous philosophers like Descartes and Locke, Hume argued that, and most notoriously Immanuel Kant, in a very, very vicious way, argued that our very means of perception are an obstacle to perception. That, in Ayn Rand's famous phrase, that we're blind because we have eyes, deaf because we have ears, deluded because we have a mind. No, the identity of consciousness is a requirement. If there was no causal means, then we couldn't know anything. Rather than being the disqualifying feature, it's a necessary feature of perception. Does that mean that we're limited to the mode of perception that we have? On the sense perceptual level, yes. But fortunately, we also have a conceptual faculty, which can analyze, integrate the material provided by the senses by means of comparison and contrast. We can organize the field of perceptual awareness into concepts, valid concepts, and using those concepts in a logical fashion, we can penetrate into the invisible. We can penetrate into the invisible, find out real things, understand even how our senses work, how my brain works. We can know all of that, but only because I'm aware that there's a mechanism, a means of doing it. Like I say, if an idea pops into your head, that doesn't guarantee that it's right. It's the method of knowing, it's the method of connecting the idea to reality, the demonstration, the proof of the idea that is all important. Once I've proven it, though, once I've taken into account all of the evidence, once I've used logic, there's no reason to doubt my conclusion anymore. And when all rational doubt has been excluded. Now, this is a hard thing to achieve. Don't get me wrong. It's not automatic. And we can only do it when we've really got the evidence. But we can get to knowledge. As I say, we can see it around us all over the place. Just drive down a highway and you can be astonished at the faculties of reason of just the drivers. Forget the inventors and builders of the vehicles involved in the engineering of it. No, knowledge is power. Knowledge is real, but knowledge is an achievement. Knowledge requires a certain methodology. That methodology does not disqualify, but actually makes possible knowledge. So understanding that consciousness must possess an identity was a big fact for philosophers to have to grapple with. It really was. And only within the last 100 years has there been a philosophy to break through the traditional misunderstandings and see that the identity of consciousness is a refutation both of mysticism, because you can't acquire knowledge just any old how. A crystal ball won't do it. That doesn't tell me how I know. See, that's a magical means of knowledge. That's knowledge without the causal mechanism that connects me to reality. The fact that consciousness must operate by a certain means, that consciousness has an identity, disqualifies every non-rational mode of claiming knowledge, doesn't it? It must possess an identity, and that identity must actually connect us to reality. On the other hand, we have the identity of consciousness, the fact that it operates by a certain process and in a certain form is not a disqualifying feature either. It's the qualifying feature. It makes it possible. It's our means of perception. It's not the obstacle to perception. And so the basic fact of the identity of consciousness refutes both mysticism and universal skepticism, simply by understanding that consciousness has to operate by a certain means. Wow, now that was a very high level sort of a epistemological discussion there, but that is exactly what philosophers have failed to do, is to give people confidence in rational knowledge, something that is quite obvious. And as I say, by the time we're adults, just to ask these philosophical questions already presupposes a whole mountain of knowledge. I couldn't even understand the question if I didn't have some knowledge. Take, for example, the claim that some people make, which is more modest than some skeptics, but it is definitely universal skepticism. All we can know are probabilities. We can never get to certainty. There's some school of philosophy called positivism. They say that everything is really, we can't really get causes. It's really just description that is the best the science can do. Can't get to causal principles or universal laws of nature or anything. They didn't deny that. And even our descriptions are only tentative in the sense that they're only 99.99% sure at best. At best. There's always some little doubt. But think about that for a second. Is that even possible? How about the rules of probability themselves? Are they certain? How about the assessment of the probability? Are there factors that go into assessing the probability? Well, if those are merely probabilistic, right? The premises that allow us to calculate the probability at all, then we have probability on probability on probability on probability on. Nothing is certain. Nothing can ever be certain. We never know anything for real. And all of our knowledge is tentative and always up for total revision. That's another huge mistake that philosophers make and have made. Because mystically asserted ideas have been refuted over and over and over again. People think that knowledge works like that, that suddenly that we know something and that knowledge, the reason overturns something at the next step. And the classic example we're given, basically the only one we're ever really given, is how Einstein sophisticated Newtonian physics. It is true that uh, Einstein elaborated on Newton and added a whole bunch to things, but it didn't really refute Isaac Newton. In fact, what Einstein showed is why Isaac Newton's observations and laws must obtain at the level that Newton was observing. Now, did Newton assert things that were wrong that Einstein had to question? Yes, such as the fact that time and space are like an absolute frame into which everything sits. Einstein said, no, time and space are relative. But Aristotle had said much the same thing that Einstein had said. What Newton was claiming was not an essential part of his science, nor did he rationally prove that time and space were absolutes. So nothing that has ever been rationally demonstrated has ever really been refuted. As Isaac Newton himself said, if I have seen further than others, it's because I have stood upon the shoulders of giants. And of course, Isaac Newton is one of the greatest of the scientific giants. And his rules still land us on the moon pretty much on a dime every time. So knowledge is possible. Knowledge doesn't get overturned when we add new knowledge. Take, for example, blood types. First, they learned when they were trying to use blood to help people who needed blood. They realized you couldn't give certain types of blood to other types of people. And they discovered the A, B, O blood typing system. And that worked most of the time, but not all the time. So what's going on? Is there something wrong with our A, B, and O system? You know, that no, we had to discover a new factor, the RH factor, A positive, O negative. And that also has to be taken into account when giving a blood transfusion. We didn't overturn A, B, and O. All we did was add a new factor. And if we're going by reason, that's all reason ever does, is add more and more and more with ever greater confidence and assurance about the stuff that came before. But lots of people really look. There were things that had been overturned. There were common misunderstandings. Take religion. Take the concept of God. Take curing people by bleeding them. That was false, but never proven by reason. And so when that kind of knowledge gets overturned, reason and knowledge isn't being cast into doubt. No, it was just being reminded that people make mistakes. That had never been proven with reason. So the bottom line is mysticism is a rejection of reason as our only means of cognition, to put it in technical language. The only way we have of really knowing anything beyond the direct perception of our senses is by means of conceptualization and the use of logic on our conceptualized perceptions. That's it. Any other means is necessarily invalid. On the other hand, this also strikes down universal skepticism. I know stuff. I have to know stuff. Knowing is my means of survival. If I were to take the wrong step while walking along the cliffs at the beach, that could be it for me. So I reject both mysticism as such, and I reject universal skepticism as such, and essentially for the same reason. We can know, we do know, but it happens by a specific causal means. It's not magic. It's not magic, with all due respect to the mystics, nor is it an obstacle, a block a blindfold, a veil of perception, as Descartes or Locke might have said, the great philosophers. It's neither an obstacle nor is it some magic. It's got to operate by an objective means, which is itself reality oriented.
Yeah, because when you have someone that thinks that I can't know anything, and you have people posting on websites like TikTok denying that Rome even existed. So I think that the type of chaotic thinking that we can't know anything at all has inspired people to make ridiculous claims on the internet and in books that this doesn't exist or that doesn't exist, despite the fact that they've been proven they've been proven to be real already. Why is it even a conversation?
It is an act of will and effort to be honest and identify the facts. It's an act, it takes effort to think. It takes a specific, purposeful mental direction to be objective. I want to know this and I want to know it honestly and completely. That already is an act of choice, an act of will on the part of the person involved. You can't force a mind. You can't force a mind. I wish, in one sense, that my mind could be forced. I would avoid a lot of errors. But alas, minds can't be forced. You can't jam into my head something. I've got to understand it firsthand and with my own knowledge, see it with my own eyes, know it with my own logic, to know it. And there are very few people. The only option to reason at the end of the day is emotion. They can call it Ouija boards, crystal balls, whatever else, and a list a mile long of their pseudo means. It's believing what they want to believe, what feels good to believe, what they were already pre-committed to believe. So emotions are your only real alternative. Psychologically speaking, that's your only option. You can give it some fancy rationalization, astrological charts or whatever. But people, if they want to believe something and they're unwilling to face the truth, then there is really nothing we can do to persuade them. It is an act of choice to open your eyes and see. And a mind simply cannot be forced. They either take the effort to be sincere and logical, the effort to think objectively, or they don't. And if they're psychologically committed to something, you're never going to get them off. But do they have that choice at all times? Yes. So I'm arguing online with someone. Someone says Roman Empire didn't exist, or some challenge to the chronology. I'll challenge them with the evidence. I'll challenge them with the evidence. I will show them coins. I will show them archaeology. I will show them things that will establish, say, the chronology that can take me all the way back to prehistoric times, practically, with physical and other evidence. And if they're not willing to see it, Jacob, Ayn Rand had a great line. She said, "An argument can be foolproof, but no argument can be damn foolproof." If a person wants to really believe it, if they're psychologically committed to it, it's almost impossible to get them off it. It's very. That's why young people are so much more open to new ideas. We get set in our ways. We get convinced of our perceptions, and we get comfortable in our own habits, whether they're good or bad or mixed. And usually, it's when people are young. Young people know the importance of ideas. Use this word that I don't like using very often, almost on an intuitive level. Young people know that ideas matter because reality matters, their lives matter, that answers to philosophical questions matter. That is the most fertile time to influence someone. But I've known many a heroic person who utterly changed their worldview and their whole approach to knowledge, to knowing, in their being a middle-aged person. That's really heroic. It takes a great deal of effort, but we all have contexts, and we all certainly have a historical context too. Before the self-conscious discovery of logic by the ancient Greeks, the rules of logic, logical inference by Aristotle, were people using logic to figure things out? Sure, unself-consciously. They didn't know what they were doing. They were sort of backing into it. But once we discover the rules of logic self-consciously, now we can apply them in a rigorous, objective way. Similarly, before the advent of the scientific method in the 17th century by men like Galileo, the experimental method, we have to learn how to learn. We have to learn how we know. We have no innate knowledge. We're not born knowing anything. We have to learn everything we know. Everything, including how to know. And we're still learning how to know. But before these discoveries, were people using observation unself-consciously in a logical way to discover truth? Of course. That's our means of knowing. That's our means of knowing. But again, this stresses the importance of philosophy. If I were to go in a time machine and ask a caveman to engage in higher calculus, let's say, do this differential equation, Mr. Gay, that would obviously be unreasonable. He's not at that context of knowing to even be able to understand what the heck I'm talking about, much less have an awareness of our means of knowing, like higher mathematics, something like that. So as humans gain more knowledge, particularly gain more knowledge about how they know and the rules of knowing, I think we can exclude. In other words, I think it'll get easier and easier for us to make the cell for reason. It has become easier and easier in Western uh, advanced countries to make the cell about reason. Imagine trying to make the cell, like I say, in a more primitive time. People wouldn't know what you're talking about. As I say, presupposes a certain amount of knowledge just to ask some of these questions. Similarly, here, people are going to be stuck in their habits, Jacob, and not break out unless they see the importance philosophically of that fancy word I used, epistemology, the branch of philosophy that studies how we know. And a self-conscious study of that is, I think, necessary for all of us. You don't have to be a professional philosopher, but philosophy is the one subject that's inescapable for plumbers, electricians, doctors, lawyers, historians, everybody, physicists, all need philosophy because we all need knowledge. It's our means of effective action. But to have confidence in our knowledge, we need to know how it is we know. How do I know that? Does the engineer have confidence that this bridge will stand? And we've built magnificent bridges that have stood for quite some time. People are still driving over some Roman bridges built 2,000 years ago. So obviously that kind of knowledge is acquirable. We can get it right. Doesn't take away the fact that we're fallible. We can get it wrong too. That's why we need to be self-conscious about our method of knowing. But if people aren't aware of it, if people are still trying to compartmentalize, well, give me this area. I'll be rational everywhere else. Give me this one little area of irrationality, like religion or something. If they that's not the way it works. All of reality is an interconnected thing. You know that old saying about lying, how one lie leads to another? Well, that's because all the facts of reality are interconnected. And so my knowledge has to be totally integrated in a perfectly consistent fashion. Any contradiction can throw a monkey wrench into the works. Any contradiction will disrupt the integrity of my thought because to be valid, my thought has to be totally logically consistent and integrated. All of my knowledge has to be made into a consistent whole. If I were to just take out one bit and think of if that bit is God, say, just give me this little corner of irrationality and faith, God. Well, can you have an objective morality if there's a God? Well, no. No. Now I have to worry about what does God want? What is God's plan? What are God's expectations? It has nothing to do with my life here on earth, which is really the only objective basis, say, for ethics, another important branch of philosophy. You see. So I guess what I'd say is that people are emotionally committed to certain beliefs. That will have a disastrous impact if they maintain that belief against logic necessarily. It will undermine all their other knowledge, just such as morality, the example I gave. Morality and God are inconsistent, in my view. Do I have to obey God? Is something good because God says so? Or does God say so because it's good by some objective? God's just looking out there saying, yeah, whether I say so or not, this is good. No, it creates all kinds of impossible questions for ethics, makes ethics non-earthly, non-objective subject for force. Figuring out God's plan and God's will becomes the end of my whole life and existence. So just that one little corner, I grant you, God's a big question, but you compartmentalize your knowledge and you allow yourself one little corner for irrationality, you will be planting a landmine that can undermine everything, literally everything else you know. And so it's very important that we reject both mysticism and universal skepticism. And why? In our advocacy of reason as the human being's only means of knowing.
And I think that when you come across people that feel like, for example, they need to find someone else as someone else. So when I was coming out with this and starting to do more videos over time, back in 2019, 2020, so I'm going way back here, 3, 4 years ago. Even 4 years ago, I was like, and I pretty much always was. Yeah, a historicist. I knew Jesus existed. Didn't doubt it for a second. But then I came across the Dutch radical scholars, like W.C. van Manen and others, and it kind of threw me off because I was like, okay, so if there's supposedly good evidence that Paul's letters were written later, so that for a time it would cause me to doubt that Paul's letters were pre-war. But then I would swing back around to it earlier this year, and it had to come with it involved the question of who is Paul, which I think that question itself, like trying to find Paul as somebody else, is utterly retarded. And it took me a minute to think about it, but eventually I was like, okay, this is stupid. What are we doing? Oh, Paul is Simon Magus. I'm like, that's ridiculous. That's obviously false. Like, not only you look at the Clementine writings, which predate Acts, it does predate Acts. You can clearly see that Simon Magus and the brief mention of Saul, but Simon Magus is all over it, are two different people. In Acts, Simon Magus and Saul are again two different people. There's no evidence that one was originally the same as the other. So it's like these people that are doing this, engaging in this, are like trying to mysticize Pauline research. The most absurd form of trying to research.
Well, I'd be careful about using the word mysticism. If they're using emotion, see, what a lot of people will do is they'll set out a rationalization for a conclusion they wanted to reach
Yeah.
at the beginning, and they'll use as you remember the Jurassic Park, how they use frog DNA.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I get
The frog
oh,
DNA to get to that conclusion, if you will.
right. But just what I mean is like, but it doesn't mean what I just said is wrong though. What I'm trying to say is, like, well, we can't know anything about Paul. So
Right.
I'm like,
And
okay,
one of the questions the Dutch radicals famously asked, "Who is Paul? Can we know?"
right.
Um, uh,
So I wondered about what Eisenman was saying. I forget if this is in the New Testament Code or James the Brother of Jesus. It's in one of those books. And he made a connection between Ananias and Paul. You know where this is going. And I was wondering, well, in the Clementine recognition, Saul does kill James, and Robert Eisman put a heavy emphasis on that. It's like, well, is Paul's identity been played with Ananias? Are we talking about Ananias? Like, I wondered that based on what Eisman was saying. Obviously, that's false because once you read the text correctly, Ananias was using Saul, so Saul was working for him. If you read Acts, it looks like that too. And he was killing James, and Acts, Stephen, who is a separate historical figure, not the same person as James, is being rewritten in such a way like he's like an actor taking over the role. So in this case, Stephen is taking over the role of the martyrdom of James, but they're not necessarily the same person. It's like they're in a literary way, they're switching places, but they are two different historical figures, nonetheless.
right.
And once we start playing around with that, then you get people saying, "Oh, Jesus is this person, Jesus is that person." And when I was younger, I was like, "Well, I wonder if there was something to that," and obviously there isn't. But that's how mysticism and basically parallel parallelominia too,
Well, if someone
for a
claims
time,
if someone claims
confused the hell out of me.
if someone claims evidence for something and claims a rational inference
Right.
of something, they are going by self-consciously going by reason. That person is not a mystic, even if they're
Mm,
getting it wrong. Even if they're getting it wrong, even if they're doing a non sequitur, even if their inference is wrong, take the arguments, the mythicist argument against Jesus being in Josephus. They will stand on their heads to
mm,
make an argument to say, well, it could be, it could be, it could be. There's no reason, for example, no reason in the first place to question, say, the James passage in the Antiquities. None, none, except their predisposition to get him out of Jesus from being mentioned by the first century historian Josephus. They are hell bent on, see, it's an emotional preference. They're using
right.
their emotions
Yeah.
to color their view of the evidence. Now, if I were to make up something, if I were to say, I think the James passage is, and I'll give you some rationalized explanation for it. It could be this, it could be this, it could be
Right.
this. And if it
Right.
was altered this way, when they actually have no evidence, that's an arbitrary assertion, one really made in the absence of any evidence. And those can be dismissed out of hand.
But do you see the point that I'm trying to make, that the idea that we know nothing about Paul, which is obviously false, therefore you start searching to solve a
Yeah.
problem to a quest that doesn't exist. To a
Yes.
problem that doesn't exist.
See, if we start
Yeah.
out with
Yeah.
skepticism and then proceed to say, but I can know, right? th- then depending on how they claim to know, um,
Right.
it, it can be sure mysticism, or it could be an overdone skepticism. Now, w- if someone were to say to me about Paul, that he was Simon Magus, I would need good evidence. And from what I understand, Dr. Price will say something like the early mentions of Simon Magus indicate that he had an argument over the law with law conservatives. That's like Paul in Galatians. Now, that is obviously insufficient. The fact that he
Yeah.
has a debate with Cephas, just like Paul in Galatians has a debate with Cephas, that doesn't make him the same either, because
Right. Right. Right.
we need better reason. Now, if we are, I would ask you, since we are talking about ancient history, there are some things, many things, which we simply don't have the evidence to say with clarity. I don't know is something we should be free and comfortable saying.
Right. I
And
agree.
until and unless we do reach the level of, having a real case for something, real evidence, it's not an arbitrary assertion like the arguments against James, which they're just pulling out of the thin. Maybe there's a mariachi band playing, Fury on the dark side of the moon every Thursday. I can make up all kinds of possibilities, and that's not a basis or an argument for anything. That's just an
Yeah.
arbitrary
Yeah.
assertion. That's how religious people argue.
Mm-hmm.
So you get it. You're absolutely right. There's a religious mode of argumentation that goes on with some of this. I need reason. If I have a reason to believe something, some evidence, some inference, then I will say something is at least possible. When the evidence on balance suggests that you've got more evidence for it and there's nothing that contradicts it, then I get to the point where I say it's probably the case. When I exclude, in effect, other possibilities, then I can say this is certain. I like with the experimental method, I've excluded the other possibilities and I know this is the only answer that works. Then I can say certain. It integrates consistently with all the rest that I
Right.
know. But that's a tall order to achieve.
Yeah.
Now, I have gone through, let me put it this way. I'll tell you about, you gave your little autobiography on changing minds about mythicism. When I was a teenager back in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a fellow named G.A. Wells. And he was a mythicist. And he
Right.
was a famous mythicist before our current crop of mythicists. And he wrote books like Did Jesus Exist? Who was Jesus? I was very much taken with his argumentation. I was very much taken with many of the observations he made, which I think to this day are still true. He made certain observations about the relationship between Paul and the Gospels and how the Jesus story grew in detail over time within Christian literature. And by inference, he went back and he began to see that began to take the decorations off the Christmas tree, and he began to say, "Hey, most of what we're told about Jesus are added later, demonstrably, decorations put on the Christmas tree." And he said, "Well, once I remove all that, there ain't no Christmas tree left." I disagree with him. By the end of his life, he even recanted his mythicism, Professor Wells, and I have to say that it was my timing is about the same as Professor Wells's. Now I give myself cut myself the slack that I was a young person. It's a good thing to change my mind. It's a good thing to test out a hypothesis if it's being held in my one of the great tests of a rational mind is being able to entertain an idea hypothetically, without committing to
Yeah.
it, without accepting it. And that's what I find myself having to do. As you know, in our discussions, what I'll do is I'll
Right.
walk around, like I say, walk around in those shoes to see how it integrates with all the rest of my knowledge.
Can we take the super chat question here just for a moment?
Yeah.
JC, thank you for the super chat prior and this one too. Can you have a valid morality if you can't prove an epistemic foundation for free will?
No, I don't think so. I think that
Mm.
without free will, it makes no sense to give anyone any normative advice, whether ethical or epistemological. I can't tell you, don't be illogical, don't commit that logical fallacy, check your facts. Any advice is senseless if we don't have free will. Advice presupposes that you could do it one way or another, and that my advice could make a difference. And if you didn't have that choice, free will is a necessary precondition for objective epistemology, not just ethics. But surely it's a condition for ethics. If I had no choice in the matter, it's senseless to praise or blame anyone for anything. There is no good, there is no bad, there is no wrong, there is no right, there's no free will. I'm just an automaton playing out what he had to do. You can't blame me any more than you can blame me for having been born in the 20th century or living now in the 21st. That's just a fact I had no choice or control over. As Aristotle said, it is only that which I can choose that I can be blamed or praised for. Choice and morality are coextensive. You deny free will, and of course, all the determinists. No, there's no such thing as a determinist who doesn't, at some level, believe in free will. They all, for example, have this illusion of free will. See, we're all deceived into, because everyone directly experiences themselves choosing. I choose whether to lift this up. Most importantly, thinking. Thinking takes effort. Thinking is the source of all my other choices. The act of thinking, to think or not to think, is that primary knob of my volitional choice. And it is only by thinking that I can come up with new alternatives. What should I do tomorrow? Can I do it this way? Can I do it that way? And I think about it. Well, if I do this and this and this and this, is my ability to project different futures. It's my ability to discover new knowledge that opens up new choices. Look at the dynamic creativity of the human species. That range of creativity, that range of individualism, which is rare to our species, it indicates the level of free will that human beings have. It's not a magical phenomenon. It is simply the power of cognitive self-regulation. There's nothing in physics that suggests that this isn't possible at all. Nothing at all. Free will is an instance of causation, not an exception to causation. Under certain conditions, this kind of consciousness must choose. That is the action it is determined to do. Choose. And those choices are limited to the options I have available. And I can expand those options only by thinking and coming up with new alternatives. But all determinists say we have this illusion of free will. In other words, they perceive the actual observed evidence of free will. They see it, it's an observable fact. But take any other mental faculty. Free will is an act of choice, a mental act of choice. Well, how do I validate that? Well, how do I validate any other mental property or capacity? Say memory. If I say, prove to me that you have the capacity for memory, what would you have to do? You'd have to remember stuff. Similarly, if I say, prove to me that you have the capacity for choice, you'd have to make certain decisions, certain choices, just to get your argument off the ground. So you can't, the determinist is always going to contradict himself. He's going to ask you to believe something, to take the choice to be a determinist, to decide whether or not to be a determinist. In fact, having the argument with him, if I'm arguing with a determinist, he's contradicting himself just by arguing with me. Just by arguing with me. He's wasting his time, in effect, as well. But yeah, objective knowledge and objective morality both presuppose free will.
JC, thank you for another super chat. I don't believe in free will at all, as free will hasn't been proven. Isn't the foundation of Western civilization not yet validated?
Well, it's true that you could have no morality, and I could give you no epistemological advice if what you're saying is true. But we don't have to prove the self-evident. I can't prove the self-evident. Once you reduce, what does scientific proof in physics consist of? Scientific proof in physics consists of reducing something to the observed. Well, you observe yourself choosing all the time. Every determinist I know admits that there's this illusion, they call it, of free will, which is inescapable. We all have this, we're all under this delusion. Well, I call that delusion direct observation, like a direct observation of blue. So when a scientist, what does a scientist do? He reduces it to direct observation. So as I say, let's go back to memory. Well, let me recommend a couple of good books, by the way. The leading academic authority on behavioral motivational psychology, the most cited academic authority on motivational psychology is Professor Edwin Locke. His recent book, The Illusion of Determinism, I highly recommend. You cannot prove any of the laws of logic, for example. It would be a circular argument. Logic itself is self-evident. That is to say, the premise of logic, the law of non-contradiction, is inherent in direct observation, as Aristotle showed. Any attempt to prove the rules of proof is a circular argument. You cannot logically infer the premises of logic. No, they're either self-evident or we don't get logic at all. And all of science, it reduces to experimentation, observation, empirical observation. Well, I include introspection as a direct form of empirical observation. How else do I know about memory, say, except through direct observation? I can't prove to you that I have the capacity for memory. Couldn't do it in a million years because it's obvious. How would I know that I remember what I had for lunch yesterday? In the act of remembering what I had for lunch yesterday, so I have to use memory to show memory. It's a circular thing. If I'm trying to infer it, that's invalid. The directly observed, looking in the microscope, the direct observation, that needs no inference. That needs no proof. And so things like my direct perception of color can't be proved. It's self-evident. My introspective awareness of that I'm emotional, that I was angry. I felt anger. I tell you, I'm angry. That introspective awareness of anger is my direct awareness of anger. You say, well, anger hasn't been proven yet, is what you've just said to me. Well, no, I don't need to prove the existence of anger any more than I need to prove the existence of memory, any more than I need to prove the existence of choice. I would have to make a lot of decisions in order to think about the matter of determinism. No, free will is obvious, as all determinists themselves admit, and they don't have any explanation for the illusion either, nor can they predict human behavior. So there's nothing like a demonstration of determinism, and that's what would require proof. Causation is a much broader thing than billiard ball causation. The idea that there couldn't be a mechanism so complex, like the human brain, that would produce a consciousness so complex that it wouldn't be capable of some limited capacity for choice is just an arbitrary assertion. There's no reason to doubt free will, is the way to look at it. More than that, any attempt to question free will involves a self-contradiction. Much of what philosophy does is to show us where the underlying knowledge is. So, for example, the law of non-contradiction is a premise to all of logic. So you couldn't prove anything. You don't get logic at all. You don't get any science, any demonstration. All these scholars writing books are wasting their time if there's no such thing as logic. Well, I don't get logic unless I have the law of non-contradiction, which is the premise of all logic. Well, how do I know that? I can't logically infer it. That would be a circular argument. It has to be self-evident. It has to be directly observed. I observe that there are no contradictions. Things are what they are and only act in accordance with their nature. Observing that directly is what makes the rest of my knowledge possible. Similarly, it is my capacity for choice that allows me to be critical of my existing knowledge. I can look back on it and say, you know what I need to focus on? You know what I need to consider? If I don't have free will, no, that's an illusion. And no objective knowledge would be possible. In other words, Mr. Determinist, if what you're saying is true, then none of us can know that anything we know isn't anything other than what we were simply determined to believe. I'd have no means of verifying it against reality.
JC, again, thank you for another super chat. It's not self-evident. It's an antipistemic supposition you have. Read Dr. Spolowski's new book.
No, I directly observe memory. I directly observe red. I directly observe my anger. I can't infer my anger for you. I'm directly aware of being angry. I'm directly aware when I perceive blue. All determinists admit that everyone perceives choice. It's an inescapable perception. That's why all determinists call it an illusion, because they are all directly aware of it. It's an immediate self-evidency, like a color, like a perception. My immediate knowledge that I possess the capacity for memory. My immediate knowledge that I possess the emotion anger. I don't infer that. I'm directly aware of it by observation. Everyone is. Now, make the choice carefully now as to whether or not you want to ask another question, and take the effort, sir, in making it just as good as you can. And I'm happy to answer these questions all day long, but it'll take a great deal of choice on your part, some very careful discernment on your part to formulate the correct question. So choose wisely.
All right, Sean, is there any interesting criticisms in the chat you'd like to pick out?
Yeah, I'm looking, and if you guys can hear me, I think I'm off mute.
Yeah, you're unmuted. You're good.
Yeah, nothing jumps out at me. I was looking at the comments going backwards, because JC already had commented before about Robert Sapolsky, if I'm saying it right, the book.
Remember, you can click on it and put it here. You have controls.
No, I'm just talking out loud.
Trying hard to convince us of determinism.
Yeah, right.
Who's best?
Well, that's a great talk, though, and I get into epistemological conversations with people a lot, and James, you hit it right on the head. What's self-evident is self-evident, and
that's why all science reduces to observe.
Yeah,
direct
talk
observation.
about it a lot. And sorry, Jacob, because I was more listening to James and or Jim, and kind of peeking at the chat, but man,
Well, before we
epistemological
post
really...
a non-super chat critical comment, let's put this one more super chat up for now. JC, thank you again. He says, I'm directly aware that I'm Messiah.
No, that is a highly conceptual identification. In other words, if you think that it's self-evident, for example, that E equals mc squared, or let's go to Newton, force equals mass times acceleration. No, those are not self-evidencies. Those have to be inferred. There's a certain category of things. Take, for example, not everyone is president of you use Messiah. Not everyone is president of the United States. To be president of the United States is a specific state. Once you tell me what that means, then I know that there's a specific kind of evidence that's required for me to make that inference. But it's an inference that someone is the president. That Joe Biden is the president requires a logical inference on my part. It's not seeing him just standing there on the podium. To know that he's president requires all kinds of conceptual, abstract identifications. Similarly with Messiah. Not so the case with the effort to think. The effort to think is something we experience directly every time we think, just as the experience of memory is directly experienced as a memory. But it has to be a concrete, specific memory of something. I'm never just remember it. For me to know that I was engaged in remembering what I had for breakfast yesterday and self-consciously step back and say, boy, that was a memory, right? All I'm doing is taking my current state, comparing it to the state yesterday, which I can remember. But I can't infer it. It takes memory to establish memory. Similarly, the validity of the senses is self-evident. The senses themselves are self-evident in their revelatory nature. That is to say, I can't know without looking. Once I look, I have to submit to it. In other words, when I'm a toddler, if there's some unpleasant reality out there, and I close my eyes to evade the reality, I learn that just covering my eyes up doesn't make the reality go away. My mind has to conform to reality. Reality is supreme. Reality is the boss. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Closing my eyes is not going to make reality go away. My consciousness is subordinate to existence. Existence has primacy. My consciousness can be an error. It has to conform to the facts. Anything beyond direct observation, anything abstract, involves, guess what? A choice. Since human beings are beings of volitional consciousness, they can deliberately choose non-rational methods. They can deliberately choose to be mystics and to disconnect from reality and to show you that it's volitional. People can live in this disconnected state of reality when it comes to abstract matters like religion. But in abstract matters, they're inferred. That's what science is. Whatever the science is, psychology, history, physics, it is the process of inferring from direct observation.
We got another super chat, JC again. Thank you. Your opposition to my claim is anti-epistemic.
Is anti what?
Anti-epistemic.
Anti-epistemic. No, it's fully epistemic. It's that's how epistemology works. Observation is the basis of all knowledge. If we didn't have senses, we wouldn't be connect. Our brains and our consciousnesses would have no actual means of connecting us to reality. So what I'm requiring is a means of knowing. Now that means of knowing can operate inferentially on the conceptual level, or I can see it directly, in which case there's no need for an inference. If direct observation isn't valid, then no science, no observational science can be valid. None of the arguments for determinism could even get off the ground if observation isn't valid. If we can't use observation to draw further inferences from, right? Determinism is the higher inference, denying the direct illusion of choice. I know that I had a choice whether or not to pick up this thing of water and take a sip. It was a choice I made, directly aware of it as a choice. If I hadn't made that choice, wouldn't have picked it up. There's nothing more to know than the fact that that was a choice of mine. There's no need for an inference if it really is within my choice, such is the nature of choice.
Yeah, he's laughing in the chat saying that you're all tangled up.
Not at all. No, in fact,
yeah, I'm not getting it either.
Well, choose carefully how you want to do this, but I'm not tangled. I would ask you how you prove to me that you have memory. How would you go about proving that you have memory? You'd have to directly introspect. And the faculty of memory is very much like the faculty of choice. It is a circular argument to attempt to prove
He
memory.
keeps saying, go read Dr. Sapolsky.
Yeah, I keep seeing that too.
I'm sure that's a fascinating book, but I've read many, many, many deterministic theories, whether it's, and there have been determinists since the dawn of time. Most of them began, it's interestingly enough, a lot of them began religiously. It's all part of God's predetermined, purposes and plans. So you'll have religious teleological determinism. You'll find that among Protestants. And so determinism is really a religious idea. And people don't realize it. It is a supposition, pure supposition. It obviously cannot be proved. Determinism couldn't be proved if you wanted to. It's just because it involves a self-contradiction. But in any case, it's denying the obvious, that people have choice. That's why they all have to go out of their way to call it an illusion. But and they hold it religiously. Won't give you their arguments. And the funny thing is that you'll even have some of these quantum theorists. No, the quantum stuff doesn't suggest free will, but what it does do is it says that their rigid billiard ball causality doesn't always apply. Now, I reject that. In quantum mechanics, I think that we can't know that at this stage. That's cutting edge knowledge. But if these physicist types are willing to believe in probabilities when it comes to quantum particles and variations on iron causation, billiard ball causation, they have a very narrow conception of causation that's biasing them. They think that the only form of causation is billiard ball causation, but that's not true. The law of cause and effect only says that things must act in accordance with their natures, and sometimes that action can be a very specified kind of choice, and that's the action that is required of me, determined for me, if you will. So, and I can't choose to become a pumpkin by snapping my fingers. Can't do magic. I can only work within the law of cause and effect, and my choice is a very specific, narrow one in cognitive self-regulation. So, but why can't a mechanism be so sophisticated as to have a capacity for a narrow, specific range of choices? They never give you that argument. They never demonstrate their point.
So, Sean, which non-super chat would you like to pull up here?
I'm gonna go back. Hold on 1 second. I just had it here. Here we go. Vesper. I saw this. You don't need objective knowledge to have knowledge. Look up. Is it fallibilism, which is a predominant philosophical principle?
It's all this crap. Excuse me. Modern philosophy is bankrupt, utterly bankrupt. They're still using religious modes of thinking, and this is a classic religious mode of thinking. Remember the relationship between skepticism and mysticism that we began the discussion with. This is a classic example. People have to undermine the power of reason. People have to undermine the objectivity of knowledge in order to make room for their own nonsense, for their own emotional preferences to be true. In order to create a space for their emotions to reign, they have to deny the universal power of reason. And anytime you hear someone saying that knowledge is not certain, possible, confident, they're flying in the face of what's obvious. We land on the moon on a dime. Every time. Still go over that bridge. Doesn't collapse. And when a bridge does collapse, there's been an error in thinking. There's been a mistake that's been made. Now, knowledge is possible. And this sort of question is simply saying knowledge is not possible. It's all hypothetical. No, objective knowledge is necessary. And in fact, it's presupposed in every word of that question. Every word presupposes objective certain knowledge. I don't know what each of those words in the question could mean if I don't have a pile of knowledge before I even start considering questions of epistemology. We only can do philosophy as adults. And to get to the mental level where we can even ask the questions requires us to have a whole pile of basic, simple knowledge, straightforward knowledge. Chairs, tables, dogs, cats. And that objective knowledge is what makes possible the rest of knowledge. There can be no highfalutin scientific theory which refutes the knowledge that science is based upon, the premises of science, such as the validity of observation or the validity of logic itself. You can't use some high fancy falutin theory to undermine science, because you couldn't have got science off the ground in the first place. You'd be cutting your legs off from under you. It's like having the top story of a skyscraper and saying, I can do without all the bottom floors. You can't. The thing falls apart. You can't formulate a question like that without a whole sophisticated stream of certain knowledge.
James, I have another one I'm going to show from Ray Oshima. Quantum suggests the universe has a basis in randomness. James, you're simply promoting a bad science understanding.
No, there are many great quantum scientists who agree with me, starting with Erwin Schrödinger. But no, the wackos in the quantum world are confusing epistemology and metaphysics on the face of it. Randomness does not exist. Causality I believe in cause and effect. There's no such thing as randomness. Randomness is only, let me put it this way, probability, odds, only reflect human ignorance. If I flip a coin, the one fact I know is that there's two sides, heads and tails. The odds of it being 50-50 are not real. It's only reflecting of my ignorance of all the factors involved, the force with which it was flipped, the atmospheric conditions, etc. If I knew all the factors involved, I could tell you exactly whether it would be heads or tails. Probability is merely a reflection of human ignorance. And this is true of all my knowledge. Quantum mechanics is a very cutting edge thing. It presupposes a whole bunch of previous physics. I can't even know quantum mechanics unless I already know Galileo, Newton, Maxwell's electromagnetic fields. I've got to know it all. And I've got to be able to just to get to quantum mechanics requires a whole bunch of previous physics knowledge just in physics. Just to get to physics requires a whole bunch of knowledge about logic and observation and so forth. So I don't get physics at all if I don't have objective knowledge, if my senses aren't valid, or if logic isn't valid, if my first level inferences are not valid, then quantum mechanics is knocked out of the court altogether. Now, you say we're at the edge of human knowledge. We're at the cutting edge. See, typical good knowledge is a spotlight in a dark room. Hopefully, we're expanding that light ever greater. But consider that edge right against where it's dark and where it's light. That's where quantum mechanics is. We don't know a lot. We're still learning a lot. These are still theories. Theories. So to say, well, this theory of advanced physics refutes the whole of everything else the science has ever established is a self-contradiction. You can't get your quantum particles. Can't even infer the existence of your quantum particles without all of that previous science being objectively true.
There you go.
No.
There's one here, and this is more of a comment. Emotion is a narrow to run forever. Emotion is a different category than thought. Thought can be logical. Emotion rarely is.
No. Emotions are a reflection. Today, we are fortunate to have lived now since the 1950s, the advent of cognitive psychology, where we have some understanding of where emotions come from. They are the product of evaluations. Most of the time when I'm angry, sad, I know why. It's no great mystery. It was some injustice that got me really angry. And if I'm angry, what you need to do is introspect. Again, introspect, and you'll get direct evidence from introspection that is valid. And if your emotion could speak, what would it say? Anger is an expression of an injustice. You have evaluated something. That's not fair. That's not just. I'm angry. All of our emotions reflect automatized value judgments. Now, sometimes these value judgments were made as a result of trauma early in our childhood. You know, when I'm a little kid, someone treats me like a jerk. I don't have a lot of knowledge, context. So can't say, well, that guy's just, if someone walked up to me and was just a jerk, that guy's just a jerk. When I'm 5 years old, what's wrong with me? And so I come to evaluative conclusions, say undermining my self-esteem. And that's how a psychology gets developed, is through these evaluations that we draw, sometimes as children, sometimes even on a pre-verbal level. We're making certain conclusions. And the whole process of psychotherapy is drawing those out. Reason and emotion can be perfectly consistent if we understand the cognition behind each of our emotions. See, on the physical level, pleasure and pain, that's automatic. I put my hand over fire, ouch. I eat something tasty,
Right.
yummy. Physical pleasure and pain. Well, on the level of consciousness, abstract consciousness, we have the equivalent of a pleasure-pain mechanism. It's a lot more sophisticated. We have a whole palette of different emotions, but they're a response to conceptual evaluations. So everything beyond the physical is a conceptual evaluation. A soldier sees the flag of his country goes up and he gets a tear in his eye. See, it's a value response. And emotions are telling us something about our values, the values we subconsciously have automatized and integrated. And we have to have some view of the universe and ourself and our relationship to the universe. And those evaluative conclusions will shape our psychology. Now, people like David Hume had no clue what emotions were. And so emotions and reason were hostile. It was a dichotomy, reason versus emotion. It is true that very often people will experience the following. Their emotions will tell them to do one thing, are leaning them in one direction, and their good judgment is leaning in the other direction. When you have that kind of situation, you really have to go by reason. You really have to go by your best judgment. And the old emotion is really just an old set of thinking, an old evaluation that you haven't yet corrected. But correct it in your thinking, figure out how you came to the wrong conclusion, act against that emotion, and believe me, it'll change over time. Otherwise, psychotherapy would be impossible.
We got ourselves a super chat here. Fiction Mission, thank you. Where did Jesus get his knowledge? Who wants to tackle that first?
Jesus is a classic case of mysticism. In fact, the New Testament is riddled with what we were talking about before. Mysticism, claims to non-rational knowledge. The wisdom of this world is foolishness, and our wisdom is foolishness to this world, says Paul. Paul describes his mystical visions. It's generally understood that when he says, I know of a man who was taken up, whether in the body or in the spirit, I do not know, up into the 7 levels of heaven and saw things which ought not be spoken of. He's talking about a mystic vision. When in the book of Acts, the early Christians are gathered together in the upper room and have the Pentecostal experience, and some are speaking in tongues and so forth. It was being described as a mystical experience. When Paul says that he had a vision of the risen Jesus, he's talking about a mystical experience. The Gospels tell us that Jesus is, in effect, a divine being. He has knowledge that he did not learn. This is stressed, for example, in the Luke story, where Jesus impresses the scholars at the temple when he's just 13 years old. And at the time of Jesus's bar mitzvah, he had unusual knowledge that he should not have had, but it blew away the scholars at the temple. So the Gospel of Luke tells us. This indicates that Jesus has special knowledge, secret knowledge. And in fact, that's what Jesus is telling his disciples all the time. I have secret knowledge. You know, I tell everyone, you look this up, Gospel of Mark has the best version of this. I tell everyone, I teach in parables to everyone else, but you disciples, you get the real deal in private. So why do I teach in parables? So that some won't get it, so that I'll be obscure. There's a mystery here. Jesus doesn't necessarily want to be clearly understood. And he obviously has access to some kind of mystical, non-causally acquired knowledge. So I would say that to answer your question, knowledge in general for the New Testament is not scientific or rational, quite the opposite. It's mysticism of some kind, revelation, faith, a vision that is the basis of knowledge. And Jesus, being a divine being, he seems to have come out of the gate with all kinds of special innate knowledge straight from the big guy. So it's not, it's really an assault on reason itself as a means of knowing. Christianity is not saying that seeing is believing, thinking is believing, and that integrating your knowledge and reducing it to observation is knowing.
There you go. I'm going to bring another one up here, Jim, from Vesper. How does James ground causality as a fundamental aspect of reality? Like, how does he know with absolute certainty there was a first cause? That's some theological speculation.
There wasn't a first cause. I utterly reject. First, causation. Causation is a corollary, just as the laws of logic are corollaries to the law of non-contradiction. So causation is a corollary to the law of non-contradiction, or the law of identity, applied to change, applied to motion. But it does take a couple of observations on the part of a child. But beyond a couple of observations, it is self-evident. I release a helium-filled balloon, it goes up. I release a rock, it falls. I push a ball, it rolls. I close my eyes, I don't see. I open my eyes, I do see. Everything operates causally. A thing can only act according to its nature. Only an acorn can become an oak tree, and only under certain circumstances. So the law of causation is universal. It applies to all action, self-evidently. Self-evidently. It is axiomatic level knowledge in that it is a direct axiomatic awareness of the fact that a thing is acting. Action is self-evident. I see action all around me. The fact of action is not something I need to prove. The fact of identity is self-evident. Things are what they are every time. No contradiction exists. If in your abstract thinking you've arrived at a contradiction, you know you've made a mistake. Because in the world of observation, things are what they are and cannot be otherwise. And so the obvious fact of change, motion, the obvious fact of the law of identity, put those together and you have the law of cause and effect. Things must act in accordance with their nature and can only act in accordance with their nature. I can't flap my wings and get to the moon. The next time I sneeze, I won't turn into a pumpkin. Only that which I'm capable of doing under the correct circumstances is what I will or can do. So the law of causation is the base of all further knowledge. In fact, you couldn't ask other questions beyond that if you didn't have that knowledge of cause and effect. If you ever doubted that things acted according to their nature, all of your knowledge, again, would be thrown into doubt. Again, you couldn't formulate a question, and any attempt to refute the law of causation is, of course, self-refuting. It's a self-contradiction.
Yeah. I'm going to keep it rolling. Let's see what Narrative Run Forever is just chatted. Mysticism is incompatible with standard physics. Physics is embedded without our inherently mystical experience. More of a comment, not a question.
It is. Well, connecting the last question with this question, not everything needs a cause. To say everything has a cause is itself quite an assertion. One thing that doesn't have a cause is everything. There's nothing left over to be everything's cause. Everything is one thing that can have no cause. So when you say, was there a cause or creator to the universe? The question is meaningless. If by universe we mean everything, then there's nothing left over to be the cause of the creator. So the question just doesn't make sense. Now, however, motion, change, action, that requires causal explanation. Things act in accordance with their natures. That's what physics, all of physics is simply spelling out the particulars on how things have to act. If things are falling on Earth, they accelerate towards Earth at a certain specified rate of acceleration. Physics discovers that. Physics discovers the causal principle behind, and that ultimately will discover the relationship between mass and gravity, for example. So physics is high-level inferencing, high-level logical inferences based on complex set of observations that are being integrated. But physics itself presupposes the law of cause and effect. The whole of physics is simply spelling out how the law of cause and effect applies to all physical objects. So, yes, I agree. Mysticism is inconsistent with physics. Mysticism is inconsistent with any kind of rational knowledge. Mysticism is the rejection of reason. Science is the application of reason to any of the questions we want to know the answers to. It's saying knowledge depends upon reason. In effect, any rational field of knowledge is a refutation of mysticism. Not just physics. All of my knowledge, even before I get into the advanced sciences, even my basic knowledge as a kid, tables and chairs and dogs and cats, very basic primary knowledge that kids get from their own direct experience. And without those earlier levels of knowledge, the higher levels of knowledge aren't even accessible. Our knowledge is built like a structure, like a structure. It really is. Just to get to Galileo and Newton, the fathers of modern physics, was an enormous achievement. And it took human beings centuries of scientific and philosophical inquiry just to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, right after that, Vesper made a comment that's action and reaction, not cause and effect. And he was the one that had said right previously that if there wasn't a first cause, how can causality exist?
It's not actions to actions, it's things to actions. If I were to tell you that there was a bunch of jumping and running going on in the next room over, and you said to me, Jim, well, what's in the next room? And I told you, no, it's an empty room. I've made it like a light bulb, a near perfect vacuum. I've emptied the room of every particle I could possibly remove. As far as I know, that room is totally empty as I can get it. Well, then you say to me, what's running? What's jumping? No, there's just a bunch of running and jumping. No. Action must relate to the entity that acts. There can be no action apart from the acting entity. Action and change are occurring. I light a match, right? I blow it out. It's the same match, but it's a different match. So is that a contradiction? No. Aristotle, it's not the same at the same time and in the same respect. Causality is asks the relationship between action and the nature of the entity. Humans alone can think in this mode, as far as we know. Maybe we can, some other creature in another planet can think like us, but on this planet, only humans can think conceptually and come up with theories of physics, for example, or trips to the moon, for example, because of our mode of consciousness. It's what I am that determines that I can do that. My nature as a human being. And if a feather falls differently than a bowling ball, it's because of the nature of the thing that's acting. All thing is the ultimate existence, an attribute. If I say there's blue in the other room, will you say to me, there's no, what's blue? No, just free-floating blueness.
I like to. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, just simply, that is a very fallacious way of approaching causation as action to action, as opposed to entity to action, which, as Aristotle understood, is the actual relationship. And this is true of all the other, what he called categories: attributes, relationships, actions. They're all only known in relation to the entity that has the attribute, the action, or the relationship to some other entity.
And I think a very fine example of knowing something happened beyond a doubt is, well, there was a war between Egypt and the Hyksos. Or Hyksos. There's no agreement on how to pronounce that. Unless you want to just skip all that and just say Heka cassette, which is the proper Egyptian way of putting it. Well, and then you have the temple being destroyed in 70 CE. We know what happened in 70 CE. We know what happened. We have archaeology. It happened. We have a bunch of texts, contemporary writers telling us about it. Why even arbitrarily assign even the slightest doubt to that? Why? Why do it?
We have the Arch of Titus. We have coins, Roman coins celebrating the victory over Judea. We have not only the physical evidence at the temple that was basically reduced to the Wailing Wall it is today, but we have a lot more to go with. Like Jacob says, we can coordinate it with text. And when you can do that, but look at what we have to do. We have to coordinate all of the evidence consistently.
And
but when you have that kind of evidence, it's purely arbitrary to doubt that the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70.
And another example of coordination that you just brought up there, when you look at Paul's letters, in this case, I'll keep it to the what is deemed to be the authentic ones, the only authentic ones. But really, the authentic ones are what is believed to be the only authentic ones. Notice I'm carefully putting it like that. Is 2 Corinthians and Romans. I did not phrase that correctly. I did not mean for that to sound like 2 Corinthians and Romans are the only ones that are authentic. No. But there are a couple examples. There's 7 letters that are deemed to be authentic. But anyway, in Romans 16 and in 2 Corinthians, I think it was chapter 11, because that's really all I need to, for the most part, pretty much in its entirety, to demonstrate the following point. Paul is related to the Herodian. He not only says so, but he tells us he fled from King Aretas. Why did he flee from Aretas? Now, let's say we only had one of those passages, but not the other. Okay, then the evidence would only be 50% as good, and we would have a problem. We can't be certain. If he just fled from Aretas, but doesn't tell us he's a kinsman to the Herods, then it could have been possibly for another reason. One could suspect maybe is a connection to the Herodians. Because the point I'm making is Josephus tells us that in 37 CE, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch, divorced Phasaelus, the princess of Nebatea, and she happens to be the daughter of King Aretas, the fourth of Nebatea, and Aretas is insulted, like, wait a minute, you're telling me you divorced my daughter so you can do incest and marry your own cousin, your own niece, Herodias. No, I don't think so. So let me just send an army down there and teach you a lesson. So that's what Aretas decides to do. He wants to massacre or capture or whatever the Herodian family. Doesn't work, but the point is he goes down there, and it's about the same time Paul's fleeing from Aretas, okay, given in 2 Corinthians. So, see, that's an example of coordination. You see what Paul says in Romans, like, okay, he says he's a kinsman to the Herods, on one hand. Then on the other hand, he's fleeing from Aretas. Now, hold on, let me finish. If you dump the Herodian reference, we just have the Aretas reference. Okay, well, that would be problematic. But if you dump the Aretas reference, you only have the Herodian reference, then it would be more clearly problematic, because the Herodian reference, if that's all we've got, then one can easily claim, well, it could have been a different Herodian. There were other people named that. Not many, though. Okay. Let's grant that. Explain him fleeing from Aretas, because we do have that. It's not just one or the other. We have both. So, why is he fleeing from Aretas then? And every time I ask that question, in my opinion, I've gotten a very unsatisfactory response. Because Paul doesn't tell us any other reason why he's fleeing from Aretas, does he? He doesn't give us a reason at all for why he's fleeing from him. It's not given. I'm thinking because it was obvious, very obvious why. His mere bloodline relationship to the Herods was reason enough. He was being chased. They were trying to capture him because of his relationship and his connections. However distant, there is a bloodline connection to the Herodian family. And when you coordinate that evidence, the Aretas, his flight from King Aretas, the whole deal of being a Herodian in Romans 16. Oh, by the way, Romans 16:10, because in Romans 16:11, that's when he mentions being a kinsman to the Herods. Romans 16:10, he mentions an Aristobulus, and Aristobulus is a unique name to the Herodian family at the time. At least I haven't been given any examples by anybody of that name being common or names of other people at the time. So there you go.
And it still has to be consistent with all of the other evidence. In other words, let me put it this way, Jacob. You've chosen the two things within the letters which I think most clearly indicate the last chapter of Romans. It's not Aristobulus, a royal Herodian name. It's the house of Aristobulus. So he's the master of a house, this Aristobulus guy. And that is a royal Herodian name. So greetings to Herodian and all those in the house of Aristobulus is very suggestive. But more than that, we have what? We have his politics. Paul has pro-Roman politics all over the place, especially in Rome. Right. There's a tradition that in Acts that Paul is a Roman citizen. Paul gets all kinds of favorable treatment from the Herodians who were trying him in the book of Acts. Whether you think Acts is historical or not, or let's take the references to Caesar's household and his access to the imperial guard in Philippians. Let's take the
Right.
fact he's literate. He knows Greek. He can read and write Greek. So he has to be a relatively highly educated elite. He seems to be a Roman citizen. He seems to be related to people with Herodian names, like Aristobulus and Herodian. His politics are Herodian, pro-Roman. When you coordinate all those things, his political perspective, his connections to Caesar's household, his connections to the imperial guard, then you put these things together. Oh my goodness, now it's really all adding up. Now we're getting more and more. In fact, Acts is telling us that he's working, as you pointed out earlier, with the high priest Ananus. Who's working with the high priests? Herodians. So when you put all the evidence together,
Let's be careful right there in that last part, the Ananias thing, because we're assuming that Acts is coherently talking about the same person as the one that wrote the letters, and I don't think that's the case.
Oh, I agree that Acts can be questioned, but simply,
massively.
simply the existence of such a tradition that he would be favorably treated before Herod Agrippa II and Berenike, as depicted in Acts, is an extraordinary thing. They seem to know about him. He seems to know about them, and they have a very friendly, positive interaction, and one in which they're trying to clearly protect Paul from the Jewish crowd. So we have a tradition that Paul is working for the high priest, is a Roman citizen, and had friendly interactions with the Herods. Whether
all of that,
true or not.
And all of that is a reason why I find Professor Bartosz Adamczewski's dating of the text to make so much sense, because 2 Corinthians is pretty much showing us that Paul's already running around doing things in the late 30s of the Common Era. So it makes sense that in the 40s, a little while later, he gets around to writing his letters. And in Romans 16, Romans is believed by many to be the last letter of Paul, although I think Bartos is right that Galatians is after Romans. And since I think that all the other letters of Paul in the New Testament are also authentic, I think 2 Timothy is the actual last letter. But anyway, by the way, 3 Corinthians is fake and it's not in the Bible, but it depends on. There are a couple of actual Bibles that not a lot of people know about that include 3 Corinthians, which I think is a mistake. But 3 Corinthians is a mess for another time, because that letter is pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, it's controversial, for example, that you put the pastorals so early as the 40s. You know as well as anyone, Jacob, that there are scholars out there who will say, no.
Oh, I know.
Have to be after before, and they're not authentic to Paul. At least some scholars. Although each of the letters, remarkably, of Paul have its defenders as authentic.
Yeah.
It's a problematic area, and I think even Dr. Adamczewski will say to you that his relative dating of the letters, the order in which they were written, he's more confident about than the absolute dating of those letters. But he does in the 40s.
Despite that, he seems to be pretty confident, because like if you look at Romans, and I think his confidence is justified when you look at Romans, it's clearly written prior to the expulsion of the Jews in 49, or if you accept Paulus Erosius's thing, 50. But either 50 being the latest and 49 being the earliest, I go with 49 at present. 49 CE, the expulsion happens. Paul states in Romans 16, Aquila and Prisca, or Priscilla, however you want to pronounce her name, is still in Rome, which is it looks to me to be a flat contradiction to Acts, and that was the beginning of the indicator, because back in like 2019, maybe early 2020, I don't remember, but definitely 2019, I was having some doubts about Saul and Paul. Can they be coherently identified as the same individual as Acts would like us to believe? And I returned to that position this year, because I'm like, yeah, I think that was correct. I think those two should be distinguished from one another, because if some people might say, well, that's absurd. Wait a minute. If we're already dismissing Acts anyway, right? If we're already dismissing Acts, and Acts is fiction, well, then what the hell difference does it make if Paul and Saul turn out to be two different people? They're already dismissing Acts as not relevant to the historical Paul. Well, what if it's just a different guy? To me, that's the same thing. Almost the same thing. So it's just, I don't see much of a difference there, because even if it's a different person, you're still dealing with the same problem. Acts is not reliable when Acts is not reliable when it comes to historical Paul, because it's
Yeah.
either fiction or it's about somebody else. Either way, same outcome. It can't be used as a reliable text.
I
when it
agree
comes
with
to
that.
historical Paul. That's the point I'm trying to make. So before people get jumpy and say this is ridiculous,
Well,
think,
if
oh yeah, that's right. It's unreliable anyway.
if we take, see, the thing is that to secure Aquila and Priscilla in Romans pre expulsion reference, we do have to rely.
Acts, I know, but that's the thing. You see, and why do I say that part of Acts is reliable in the critical analysis? Well, because Acts, the writer of Acts stumbled, in my opinion. Acts knew Paul's letters. It's like, okay, he got himself stuck. He admits that Aquila and Priscilla were in Rome still, which makes sense with Romans because Aquila and Priscilla didn't return to Rome, did they? Not even in Acts, at least last time I checked. So in Romans 16, they're still in Rome, which that in itself implies they weren't being that they weren't expelled yet. Acts says they were in Rome, and then later they were expelled along with everybody else, the rest of the Jewish population. So Romans, from those 2 points, from those two things, that indicates to me that it was written prior to the expulsion.
And that's
And
what
yet,
later, and if we believe that that's at least one of the later Pauline,
and yet,
that
just
puts
so I can finish this point,
yeah.
acts like that. Oh, Saul, who is supposedly Paul, never met Aquila and Priscilla before. I'm like, what? I don't get it. Paul wrote Romans while they were still in Rome. You even admit that they were expelled, right? They were in Rome at one point. So what's going on here? Can't have it both ways, Acts or Luke, or if you believe it's anonymous and whoever the hell it is. So
I think that the Ritus reference and that reference both indicate that at least some of the Pauline material has to be dated to the 40s. And I think that's a good argument. I think it's a strong case. Remember, all we have are these darn texts and what the letters say to go by.
yeah.
Our first physical copies don't start showing up till the second half of the second
Right.
century.
There's
And
one more point I'd like to make here, if you don't mind.
no,
I know I'm butting in.
no, go.
Let's take a look at Acts, and a little bit more in depth. Acts and those Josephus, and more scholars are gravitating to that point. Okay.
That's hard to avoid. Acts,
Okay. Acts talks about a lot of things that Josephus talks about. The Egyptian false prophet. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. Josephus says the same thing. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. Luke, who is the same person that wrote is the same guy that wrote Acts, talks about the Emmaus narrative, which is very similar to the Testimonium Flavianum and the Testimonium Slavianum, if you believe, as I do, that Slavonic Josephus is authentic. But that's a very controversial issue that has to do with Robert Eisler another time.
but I think
question real quick. Todd Radmaker says, Jacob, why couldn't Prisca and Aquila return to Rome? Well, show me the text where they did, and then we'll talk. I'm just being real. Like, where's the text that they said that? Where's the text that says they returned to Rome? I don't know of anything. So, I mean, I guess they could have, but I don't have any reason to think that's what happened. In Romans, there's no mention of Aquila and Prisca having returned to Rome from an earlier departure. So there's something else I wanted to point out. By the way, that's not the only contradiction. There are others. Like take in Philippians, a lack of emphasis. In Philippians, Paul heavily emphasizes that he is a Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Benjamite. Now, at first you might say, well, being a Benjamite makes sense because he was called Saul, right? Like King Saul was a Benjamite. So that doesn't appear to be a problem there, right? No, there is. Why does Acts think that Saul was taught by Gamaliel, but Paul fails to mention it in Philippians when he's boasting about his being a Hebrew of Hebrews? What's going on there?
Well trained in Pharisee.
It gets worse. 2 Corinthians is free shipwrecks. lot of people don't even realize that. Oh, we talk about the shipwreck in Acts, the Adriatic Sea. I'm like, wait a minute. No. 2 Corinthians is 3 shipwrecks. Acts only has 1. Which is it? And the other thing is you have Saul being in contact with high priests in Acts, but Paul the Apostle makes no mention of such a thing going on in his letters. So there's a lot of differences. And also Saul in Acts is being protected by Romans more clearly than Paul is in the epistles. Now, to a point, yeah, Paul is being protected somewhat, but Saul in Acts is getting protected all the time. And at least it looks that way to me. And the other thing is that there are 2 different. A lot of people don't realize this. There's 2 contradictory martyrdoms of Paul. In Clement, he was killed because of religious rivalry, probably by zealots. I suspect zealots. And the second martyrdom supposedly happened under Nero when Saul was beheaded. I'm like, wait a minute. Was he killed by Romans or was he killed by religious people? Which is it? Can't be both. It's like trying to convince me that Judas Iscariot hanged himself but exploded everywhere at the same time when he swelled up.
References to Paul's death come late, and they come in dubious sources. Now, Paul is sort of seeming, some say, to anticipate his final journey to Spain and anticipate his death. He's worried about it. So some have inferred from that we're getting close to his death. But again, that's just an inference. While most scholars will at least put what they regard as the authentic letters of Paul in the 50s or early 60s, I think that for some of them, a 40s dating is not unreasonable.
Bartos puts the letters in the 40s. I think, if I remember correctly, yeah, Steve Mason puts it in the 40s too. He said to me he prefers the letters in the 40s. He said something like that to me. So there are scholars that do put the letters in the 40s. A few. I think quite a few, actually. I don't have all the names in front of me right now, but I just gave a couple.
Are you close to the idea? Let me put it this way: are you open to the idea that First and Second Corinthians and Galatians and Philippians? Let's get rid of Galatians. Philippians and First and Second Corinthians.
I was going to say
are edited versions of various letters being compressed into.
I think that Dr. Frank Hughes makes a strong case that 2 Corinthians is a collection of multiple letters to the Corinthians that have been compressed into 2 Corinthians. I think I'm on board with that. That makes sense.
First Corinthians and Philippians?
Yeah, I think so as well. When they were compressed, I think is a conversation for another time because it's going to.
Okay. I was just going to ask you about your thoughts, because it seems that while the material is,
I need to make some decisions about that I'm not comfortable talking about right now.
Okay, fair enough. That's my mind.
I learned my lesson a few times.
But there's nothing wrong with changing your mind.
I know.
The point is that shows honesty. If you're going by your best judgment of the evidence, and that's all we can do.
Right.
Look, we're talking about ancient history here, and various people have had various theories on the topic. And it's ancient history. Our evidence is fragmentary. You really have to integrate it all.
What I will say is, I think,
and vertically, if you will, to go back to the epistemology, you've got to integrate all the data, both.
What is clear to me is the letter correspondence to Corinth ended in 46 CE, since Paul wrote Galatians in 49. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that the vision that he had when he was taken up to the third heaven happened 14 years ago. In Galatians, it's 14 plus 3 years, which means 17 years ago. So given that, whenever you date 2 Corinthians and Galatians has to be 3 years after 2 Corinthians. Case in point. And such a thing, just by that alone, in my view, is another contradiction with Acts. As Acts seems like it's trying to give a longer time span of ministry with Saul. To Paul, by making the claim it's the same person. And I just don't think that works. And when Paul confronts James, for example, in
Yes.
Galatians.
And that, I think, Jay, I don't mean to interrupt, but that I think is
Sure.
critical to the dating issue. The James, who's the brother of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
according to Josephus, dies in 62. If that's the same, and I think we have every reason to believe it's the same as James, brother of the Lord, that Paul is arguing with in Galatians,
It
that
has to be,
requires that whatever we
quite
regard.
clearly the same James.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And it means that the authentic Pauline
well,
corpus is
here's what's interesting, and this used to confound me back then. Like, okay, when I tried to go back and I was like, okay, let me bury my head in this and try to make this work. And I sure realized, like, no, I was on the right track. They aren't the same guy. Come on. I was getting ahead there, and I'm like, oh, and I backed down. I shouldn't have. And when you throw Acts out of the equation, pretty much, the late dating of Paul doesn't stand a chance. Not in the slightest. You need Acts. You need to make the assertion that Acts is covering a certain segment of Paul's life from 50 to 62, 63, whatever. You have to make that assertion in order to claim, in order to make the next assertion that, wait, you see, Acts doesn't mention Paul writing any letters in that time span. Maybe he wrote them later. And then, since if you want to go with that position and say Acts is only a semi biography of Paul's life, excuse me, as it doesn't cover all of it, then you can make the claim that he wrote the letters later, or even before.
Would you feel
But
comfortable with me asking this question, Jacob? It seems to me that with the Aretas reference and with the James reference, we're actually given neat little bookends of timing for whatever we determine the authentic Pauline letters to be, sometime between the late 30s and the early 60s. So Pauline dating in the 40s and 50s has made a lot of sense to scholars,
yeah,
especially the 50s. 40s seems a little
sure,
early to some people, but
okay.
would you accept that the temporal bounds sort of are between the Aretas attack and the death of James for whatever we decide is the authentic Pauline material?
Well, I would be careful answering that question because considering Paul wrote Romans prior to the expulsion, it looks like he's got, to me, all the letters down by 49. I think it's hard, even for me now, to imagine he's writing any later, unless you want to force Saul and Paul to be the same person, which I don't think can be done. Let me make a slight correction to what I just said a couple minutes ago. What I said a couple minutes ago, when I said that Paul's letters can either be dated before the events of Acts or after the events of Acts. No, it really would have to be after the events of Acts if you want to force Paul and Saul to be the same guy, in my view, because that would at least make some better sense, but it would still have a bunch of problems. If you want to make the assertion he wrote, Acts doesn't mention Paul's letters because it was written before the events of Acts. Well, then how do you deal with James, son of Zebedee? Because James, son of Zebedee, is in Acts. He dies and he's killed and executed in 41 CE when he has some kind of problem and criticizes King Herod Agrippa. And King Herod Agrippa was like, I really don't like your criticism, so he kills him. End of that story. So if we're gonna force the two to be the same person, regardless of all the loads of biographical contradictions, endless biographical contradictions between the two of them, then you would have to date the letters after Acts. Even then, that wouldn't solve a lot of problems. Which is something I realized. I'm like, yeah, you've got to keep Acts out of the equation. Bartos is right. Dennis is right. Steve Mason's right. You gotta look at the letters to reconstruct the historical Paul. You gotta try to avoid Acts. You really do.
Acts,
Regardless if you think Acts is creating, either Acts is all fiction, the whole thing, cover to cover, or it's a different person. Either way, you come to the same conclusion. You can't use Acts to reconstruct the historical Paul.
well, it's no question that Acts is dissembling, is lying to us, distorting on purpose. It's whitewashing what appears to be the
I
meaning
don't
of.
mean to interrupt, James. I've got to respond to this. Naruto Run Forever says you have to push Paul later if you go if Paul equals Josephus Fury. That I don't know if you believe this, Naruto, so no offense in case you do. And this goes back to a certain somebody I criticized back then. And I mean, still do, just in case I'm giving the wrong impression there. Paul and Josephus being the same person. It's just utterly utterly insane to me. One of the most it reigns almost or practically supreme or close to it in crankery. That is just, you don't see me using that word very often, crankery, but this is just crankery. Absolutely crankery. The letters of Paul. Forgive me if I sound frustrated and my voice is raising, but the letters of Paul are highly theological, written by someone that has a Christian type of thinking, but doesn't use the term Christian. I get it. The term Christian didn't exist yet when Paul's writing. That's irrelevant. But Josephus uses the term Christian if you believe the testimony of Flavianus is authentic, which I sure do. But even then, that doesn't solve anything. You can't force these two people to be the same person. And not only do you have to claim that Acts gets everything right practically before we even try to say that this is possible, which it can't be done. And to say that Josephus wrote Paul's letters, when he mentions Saul, calls Saul a wicked man, is he calling himself a wicked man and having schizophrenia? And he's forgetting that, wait, I'm that Saul guy I'm criticizing. Like, come on.
If the Saul mentioned in Job, there's only one.
And one last thing I want to say real quick to that effect is, and that's not even getting into the issue of Saul and Paul being two different people, when the evidence for that is pretty strong. Regardless, if you start with the idea that Acts is fiction or it's two different people.
If we mean that the author of Paul's letters is the same as the author of the works of Josephus, I'm confident that person. If you read the material, you'll see they, as James pointed out, have wholly different emphasis, wholly different vocabulary, wholly different style, wholly different approach.
Yeah. Let's cut right to the chase. Paul equals Josephus is impossible, and I'm not open to being convinced.
There's two very distinct bodies of literature that I'm written by two different people.
I'll go further than that. I think believing Paul equals Josephus is almost as insane as Flatter. If you can quote me on that.
Well,
seriously quote me on that.
Surely, as Hellenized Jews, Paul has Hellenized Messianic Jews. Paul and Josephus share a great deal of ideological perspective. Only the content of their works convinces me that they had an entirely different emphasis in their approach, an entirely different style and vocabulary, an entirely different purpose, and that renders them two separate authors.
Back then, I was trying to open up to that identity game. I was wondering if a couple of things could work. I'm like, no, it just can't. I pulled my head out of there, out of the wall there. I'm like, no, this is insane. None of this was necessary. It's all crankery. Paul is Paul. And Paul is Paul. Why can't we just say Paul is Paul?
In the face of the evidence of two distinct bodies of literature that appear to be written by two different authors, I need a darn good reason to make the identification. I don't even have a bad reason that's been offered to make the identification. Merely sharing generally, as I say, they're both highly Hellenized, Greek literate, Messianic Jews of the first century. But so they share a lot of perspective on things. They have the same politics, and so forth. But they're clearly two different sets of literature. And if someone is going to try and convince me that they're the same person, I'm going to need a really good reason, and none has been offered. On the face of it, they're two different authors.
Benjamin Okoa says, I don't see this connection. Saul becomes Paul once he becomes a follower of Jesus. Well, by itself, that wouldn't be a problem, but the problem is he fails to mention that in his letters. In fact, I would have expected him to mention that he was once known as Saul when he was boasting about being a Benjamite in Philippians, which he, by the way, totally failed to do. And by the way, that's not if that was the only thing, I wouldn't be taking too much issue with this. But no, it's not. There are loads of contradictions. How about the vision? The vision, for example, we have two different visions. Robert Eisman points this out too. Professor Eisman points out that look. In 2 Corinthians, his flight from Damascus happens earlier. It's in the late 30s. He's fleeing from King Aretas. But in Acts, he's fleeing from Jews. It's happening like 20, 30 years later. Well, which is it? Is he getting on a basket and being lowered down twice, 20, 30 years apart? In the same situation, fleeing from two different like at one point earlier, as a read, at a later point, he's fleeing from Jews that want his head. Which is it? I'm not going to believe that both of that happened to the same person in the same exact way, in the same location. Come on. I'm no.
Told that the Saul who helps in the execution of James was a young man at that time. If he's a young man in 62, who is the author of the letters before that? And if we have evidence that letters go back to the 40s, then it's really not credible that whoever that young man was helping to kill James. I'll tell you, one of the things that helped get me along the lines of thinking of two different people. We have a young man, Saul, helping with the execution of James in 62. Yeah. That makes it implausible for me to believe that he is the author of material, some of which Jacob and Dr. Adamczewski have persuaded me comes from the 40s. So it can't be the same person. And as I say, I think we get a good frame for the time, at least. I think I want to know. I think I'd ask Dr. I won't talk about Jacob because he doesn't want to share his ideas fully on this. But I'd ask Dr. Adamczewski how he knows for sure when Paul died. He believes Paul died 4950.
49 specifically. He doesn't really go 50 on that.
But if Paul is dead by 50, then that does force certain inferences to be made. But I'm not convinced of that yet. I need evidence to know that he died around that time. And I'm not sure we have evidence of that. On the other hand, I'm comfortable that the young man, Saul, who's helping with the execution in 62, is not likely to be the same guy. He's still working for the high priest. He's still being a troublemaker in the 60s, according to Josephus. He's not had his vision of reform yet, if it's Saul we're talking about. So there are temporal problems, and that's not the least of them when you look at Acts and you try and coordinate the evidence. But it seems to me that if we have an author of letters as early as the 40s, which I'm reasonably convinced is true, it can't be the same person as this young guy helping with the execution of James in 62.
Yeah, the Saul person seems to be a lot more aggressive in personality than Paul is. A lot more aggressive, but really bad temper, especially when you look at Josephus and Acts. And I think the Saul that's in Acts is I think Acts is talking about the Saul that's in Josephus. Just to be clear,
whoever wrote Galatians is pretty teed off at James and Cephas. I tell you, he's using some harsh language.
Yes, but I don't recall it saying that Paul killed anybody. Saul's killing people.
No.
Saul's like, no, I'm not Paul. I'm not nice.
The idea that he
not like how Paul was very nice anyway.
I'm not sure what it means, but he does admit he was a persecutor of Christians, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And I think that Paul probably did hunt him down and kill him during Jesus' lifetime. I think his conversion happened not long after the crucifixion in 32 CE. So I mean, he's no different than Saul in that to that degree. They both murdered people. Yes. So I just need to correct the way I was phrasing and distinguishing between the two attitudes earlier. But the point is, Saul, and this this is the thing that here it is. If this doesn't show these are two different people we're talking about here, I don't know what will. Okay. Saul kills James in 62 CE as far as Clement is concerned, and we know that Ananus, as Josephus says, he ordered the death of James. So Ananus didn't kill him himself personally. Someone was sent after James, and it was Saul and his mob that had James killed in 62 CE, as Clement recounts in the Clementine recognitions, or at least he tells us. I don't think Clement was it's probably unlikely that Clement was there at the actual scene. Either way, Acts calls him a young man at the death of Stephen. Now here's the thing that we need to. I'm going to note here.
And the thing we're assuming is that Stephen's martyrdom is a rewrite of James's death, but you and I both are convinced of that part of Eisenman's argument.
But there was an actual Stephen that was killed in the 40s, and even in Josephus, by the way. Again, more evidence. Acts uses Josephus because Josephus tells us this.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what happened. And Saul was still persecuting people even in the year 66 CE, according to Josephus Flavius. As late as 66 CE. So the conversion couldn't have happened yet until no earlier than 66 CE. Because it's 66 CE when the Jewish war is beginning. Saul fled from the Herodian palace with a few others as it was being burned down. And Saul was being rescued by Roman troops. That does not work with a vision that Paul is having in 32 CE and in a flight from Damascus in 37 CE, which is for 32 CE. That's when he converted. And 5 years later, he fled from Damascus. That is a total contradiction of what the Saul that Josephus in Acts is talking about. Completely and flat out. It is a flat out contradiction with the chronology we are being presented there by Josephus in Acts regarding this Saul person. So even if one doesn't accept the James and Stephen literary connections, well, I don't even need that. Forget all that. We got a text directly telling us that Saul is still persecuting people in 66 CE. He was persecuting Jews, not Christians. Again, when Josephus wrote the Jewish Wars, in which he's talking about this, and he talks about some of this in Antiquities as well, Saul, when he was persecuting people in the 60s, the term Christian didn't exist yet, as far as I can tell. I think that the term Christian is late 1st century CE, probably 90s CE invention. And Josephus uses the term in the Antiquities, so it's definitely attested by the time Josephus is writing and published the Antiquities in 94 CE. So that's clear. I suppose it could be earlier, but I don't see it. But in any case, Acts also uses the term Christian, by the way. Again, and in my opinion, that's more evidence that Acts knows Josephus. Again, notice how much Acts is imitating Josephus, mentioning a lot of the same things that Josephus does. Even mentioning the Egyptian false prophet. Why didn't it just call the Egyptian by his name then, when Josephus fails to?
Right.
Again, Steve Mason points out that's a very similar to Josephus.
Exactly. No, there's really, really good reason to believe that Acts
right.
Josephus quite well. And there's no question that the letters don't use the term Christian.
Right. No, they don't. None of them do. And in Acts of the Apostles, supposedly Saul encounters the term Christian, but Paul never did. How about that? So that's the problem. And when you put all that together, that chronology just doesn't work with Paul's letters. You can try everything under the sun. You're not going to make all that fit. You're not going to fit a triangle into a square peg.
Well, one thing I was convinced of early on, I mean, I must admit, I was lured as a young man into mythicism, and I found my.
You're not going to fit a hexagon in the square peg. That's what I should have said.
Right. I found my way to historicism long ago. But one thing I have always sort of felt confident about is that those letters are look to me to be compressions of multiple letters, and we have multiple authors, we have seams that show, we have multiple greetings and farewells.
Co-authors, a point that I've made many times.
So while I do believe that the contents of the Pauline epistles are 1st century in the composition, I think towards the end of the 1st century there was a compression, a redaction, a final redaction that is post-war and later in the 1st century.
And here's another thing. If I'm interrupting, I apologize.
Oh,
so the thing here's everything to think about. Acts knows Josephus, right? Paul's epistles don't know Josephus. Paul's writing between Philo and Josephus. I think Paul knew Philo and some other stuff, but that's another time.
Paul seems to have awareness of Philo, but not
Paul's literary sources is a whole nother video.
Right.
We've been at this for over 2 hours. So let's get our final thoughts in here. Okay, so here's the deal. Paul's letters don't know Josephus. Josephus is writing between Philo. I'm sorry, Paul is writing between Philo and Josephus. Almost screwed up there.
Agreed.
And Acts knows Josephus. So Acts talks about Saul. Josephus talks about Saul. Josephus talks about a shipwreck in the Adriatic Sea that he had. There's a shipwreck in the Adriatic Sea in Acts. You see, even the mention of Saul totally fits Acts knowing Josephus. Totally does.
I'm thoroughly convinced Luke Acts knows Josephus well. I'm growing more and more convinced that the Gospels as such were familiar with Josephus. Certainly Luke Acts.
Right, right.
See there, I used the word certainly.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I think it's hard to deny. It's
Yeah.
especially when you admit Acts knows Clement, the original Clementine recognitions, which was written pretty much at the right when the first century CE was about to end, and about that time, circa 99 CE. And like once you get to that, then Acts is much later than Josephus, and Acts can know the writings of Josephus. And I will end this by saying Clement speaks positively of Paul in First Clement, but he speaks negatively of Saul in the recognitions and never says it's the same person. Riddle me that.
The Clementine recognition, the Clementine literature,
Yeah.
never says they're the same. Acts.
Gets around to it. Nope.
Yeah.
No. Riddle me that they're the same. Well, this has been fun.
It sure
We
has.
talked about quite a lot.
A whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah, these are fun. We should do more. We should do more of these.
You know, ask where people get to ask the questions. I really enjoy it very, very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for the good questions, by the way.
Thank you for joining me, and you too, Sean. Thanks for
Great.
joining.
Yeah, thanks,
for joining us
guys.
tonight.
Always.
Take care, my friends.
Yeah, take care.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.